Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now a lot of you were surprised to learn of the existence of the 12GB RTX 2060 in the previous videos. This card launched after the original 6GB card as well as after the 8GB 2060 Super and offered performance somewhere in between. The extra VRam definitely helped it stretch its legs in certain gaming scenarios, but at its core it's still a 2060, an entry level RTX card, so it usually reaches its performance ceiling before maxing out all of the available VRAM. Today I thought it would be interesting to compare the 12GB 2060 to this, the RTX 5060, which launched almost 3.5 years after the 12GB 2060, but has 4GB less memory. The 8GB 5060 is okay in my book. It offers solid gaming performance for less than 250 quid here in the UK, but it would have definitely been nice to see it equipped with 12GB of VRAM or launched with a lower price tag. I'm still expecting the newer card to outperform the older VRAM rich GPU, but let's look at a few side-by-side comparisons before talking about a couple of noteworthy points that may surprise you. Today's first featured game is Counter-Strike 2. The 12GB 2060 is definitely going to be making use of the extra memory in today's tests, CS2 included, so compared to the original 6GB card this definitely gives you more peace of mind in 2025, even if it isn't going to be massively ahead in terms of performance. When compared to the 5060 however, an 8GB card that's a few generations newer, the entry-level 50 series GPU pulls ahead by around 100 FPS on average. Interestingly, this performance gap closes quite significantly when it comes to the percentile lows, but the 5060 is still the clear winner here. The 12GB 2060 still offers a decent, consistent gameplay experience though. Next up we have GTA 5 Enhanced with the very high ray tracing preset. The game utilises over 6GB of VRAM again at these settings, just like we saw in CS2. Again, I'm pretty happy with how the older card handled itself, and it's nice that we can make use of the new ray tracing options while still retaining over 60 frames per second. That said, 2025's 5060 doubled the performance in some areas of the map, though this wasn't quite the case overall. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is playable with over 60 FPS on the 12GB 2060 with an average of 66, the 1% low was 58 and the 0.1% low was 56. Again, I think we have the extra memory to thank for the consistency. It's a shame that this card is still quite difficult to find, but its scarcity can also mean a higher price tag, meaning that it might be more expensive than the 2060 Super, or very close in price to the 3060, both generally superior cards. I'll talk about the generally part a little later on. In Kingdom Come, the 8GB 5060 hit 111 FPS with a 1% low of 85 and a 0.1% low of 70, pulling ahead as expected once again. The 12GB 2060 managed 67 FPS in Cyberpunk with the high preset, along with the high textures and crowds. The percentile lows were 48 and 27. A little bit of DLSS upscaling would go quite a long way in making sure that the game maintained a more constant 60 plus FPS, but as you know, I tend to keep things at native for comparative testing. The 5060 averaged 87 FPS, so one of the smaller performance increases we've seen today. In fact, the 1% low was only 5 FPS higher with this card, but it looks like we may be running into a little bit of CPU bottlenecking with my i7-12700F. That said, the 0.1% low of 47 meant the game was a lot smoother here. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is interesting. We'll talk about this one again a bit later on, but if we look at the medium settings side-by-side comparison, we can see that the 5060 pulls quite far ahead, at least with this preset. We're looking at almost double the frame rate on average for the newer 8GB card, but as I said, we'll come back to this at the end and turn the settings up a little bit. Finally, we have Red Dead Redemption 2 with the ultra textures and everything else set to medium for an average of 79 FPS on 2021's RTX 2060 12GB and 120 FPS for the newer 5060. I think the outcome was probably obvious in terms of these side-by-side results, but the competition is not over yet because, of course, we need to talk about VRAM, because although the newer card is superior overall, especially if you are a little more lenient in terms of the settings, it's when we turn things up that we start to see problems for the 50 series GPU. Now the 2060 of course has 12 gigs of GDDR6 and the 5060 has 8 gigs of GDDR7, but the memory type is sort of irrelevant for this next part. Like I said before, the 2060 is more limited in terms of graphics settings regardless of the extra 4 gigs of memory. It is older and weaker, and you'll probably run into natural performance limitations before a VRAM limitation. It is just nice to have the headroom though, because compared to the original card, this one does use more than 6 gigs of memory. Now, running into a performance limitation before a VRAM one isn't always the case with the 5060, which seems like it could definitely benefit from more VRAM if it had it, but of course it doesn't. Now, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 here is a good example. I wouldn't recommend using the experimental graphics like I've done here with either card, as the 5060 will get less than 60 frames per second, and the 2060, well, that won't even hit 30 frames per second. But the 5060 suffers an additional problem. VRAM, of course. Despite the 5060's better overall performance, it suffered a lot more from huge slowdowns and frame drops. Sometimes the game even dropped down to single digits. I saw just 9 FPS at one point. Now, of course, the 2060 has its own problems, the main one being a sub 30 FPS average, but because of the 12 gigs of memory, we didn't see the same huge frame rate drops and stutters. If we look at the 2060 12 gig footage, we can see that the game is utilising more than 8 gigs of VRAM, which the 5060 is limited to, and although this isn't ideal, at no point did it hit single digit figures. So I guess you could say in some ways the 2060, despite having a lower average frame rate, is a bit more consistent. Maybe this is irrelevant because you probably won't be using experimental settings with this older card anyway, but I think it's interesting to note. If we look at Indiana Jones again, then the 2060 potentially wins by default in this one if you want to utilise higher visual presets. The 8GB RTX 5060 will cause the game to crash with the high preset selected. We can choose it in game, but when we go and reset the game or restart it in order to sort of enable these new visual options, then it'll get so far as some of the splash screens and then just quit to desktop. At least it did every single time I tried it. I could only play with the medium settings or lower. Now in the case of the 2060 12 gig, the older card, not only could we select the high settings, but we could actually enjoy the game with over 50 frames per second most of the time. So unlike Kingdom Come, this is an example of settings that are far more reasonable to use and ones that are going to work just fine on this older generation GPU. Now, how many other scenarios are there whereby the 12 gig 2060 will win by default because of the extra memory, I wonder? I'm not saying buy a 12 gig 2060 instead of a 5060, of course, unless you only play Indiana Jones and you're determined to run things on the high settings. I just thought this result was interesting to include, and it goes to show that I really think we do need more VRAM on these entry level cards now, because the 5060, for example, would be capable of playing Indiana Jones with higher settings if not for the VRAM amount. But let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching. Hopefully I'll see all of you again in the next one.